When Sophie first met Lucas, it was as if the universe had conspired to align their paths. Their connection was immediate, an undeniable spark that quickly ignited into something profound. Their first date, a cozy dinner at a quiet cafe, felt like the beginning of a long, effortless story. They spoke for hours, sharing their dreams, fears, and the little details that most people kept hidden. Lucas had a way of making Sophie feel like the most important person in the world, his attention unwavering, his words thoughtful. It was a kind of love she had never known, and she had quickly fallen for him, all in. As the years passed, their bond only deepened. Sophie adored the small rituals they had created, waking up to the warmth of his body next to hers, the shared laughter over breakfast, the quiet moments when he kissed her forehead before leaving for work. Their love felt like a safe harbor in an often chaotic world. No matter how stressful their lives became, their marriage was their constant, their anchor. When Sophie thought about her husband, she thought of everything that made him uniquely him, the gentle way he touched her when they were together, the sweet and sometimes silly things he said to make her laugh. She even found herself smiling to herself when he would wrap his arms around her at night, the two of them nestled together under the covers. These moments, simple yet significant, gave her a sense of peace, an unshakable belief that their love was invincible. And yet, there was something about their closeness that made Sophie feel incredibly vulnerable, as if she were walking on a tightrope, balancing her happiness on the edge of something fragile. She knew that, deep down, this love she cherished was delicate, something that could be easily shattered if not treated with care. The idea of losing him, was too much for her to bear. But Lucas was everything to her. His touch, his laughter, the way he spoke her name, each part of him filled a place in her heart she never knew was empty. Every night, as they lay together, Sophie would savor the moments when he would kiss her goodnight, his lips lingering just long enough for her to feel the depth of his affection. It was a love that felt eternal, one she believed would last a lifetime. She knew their connection wasn't perfect, no relationship was, but the trust they shared was undeniable. Sophie couldn't imagine a world where she wasn't wrapped in the safety of his arms, where he wasn't the first thing she saw when she woke up in the morning. Still, as they both lay there, sleep slowly creeping over them, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. It wasn't anything she could pinpoint, just a faint shift in the air, like the calm before a storm. But for now, she let the thoughts go, closing her eyes and allowing herself to drift into sleep, with Lucas beside her, just as it had always been. But sometimes, the hardest moments are the ones that come when everything seems perfect. And Sophie couldn't yet see the quiet storm that would soon alter everything. As the weeks passed, Sophie began to notice subtle shifts in Lucas's behavior, changes so small they were easy to dismiss at first, but undeniable once pieced together. It wasn't that he had become cold or distant overnight, but something had shifted in the way he interacted with her. He no longer kissed her good morning with the same enthusiasm, his embraces felt less genuine, and the conversations that once flowed effortlessly now seemed strained, as if he were distracted by someone else. Sophie told herself it was nothing. Perhaps he was stressed at work, or maybe he was just tired. After all, they had both been working late, juggling their careers and maintaining the delicate balance of their marriage. She tried to reassure herself, but the nagging feeling in the pit of her stomach wouldn't fade. There were evenings when Lucas would come home late, his eyes glazed over, his mind clearly elsewhere, and Sophie would lie awake next to him, pretending to be asleep, listening to the quiet hum of his breathing. She had always prided herself on their deep connection, but lately, it felt like a chasm was growing between them. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Sophie looked at Lucas, studying the way his fingers absent-mindedly traced the rim of his coffee cup. He was physically present, but emotionally, he seemed miles away. "Is everything okay?" Sophie asked, her voice tentative. She was afraid to ask, yet the question had been pressing on her for days. The silence that followed felt suffocating. Lucas glanced at her, a brief flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "Yeah, Just a little tired, he replied, but his tone lacked conviction. Sophie could see it, the smallest shift in his gaze, the way his words didn't match his body language. It was almost as if he were lying, or at least hiding something. She wanted to press further, but she didn't. Instead, she smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes, and nodded. Okay, just let me know if you need anything. But inside, Sophie was unraveling. The self-doubt crept in like an unwelcome guest, poisoning her thoughts. Was she imagining things? Was it just a phase, or was something more serious going on? She couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't enough anymore, that somehow she had lost the person who used to see only her. And then there was Matt. Matt was a colleague, someone she had known for years, and the two had always enjoyed an easy camaraderie. He was kind, supportive, and had always made her feel appreciated in ways she hadn't realized she was craving. He seemed to notice when she was feeling off, when the strain of her marriage was starting to show. His words, gentle and understanding, became a comfort, and when he smiled at her during their late work sessions, Sophie couldn't help but feel a spark of warmth that she hadn't felt in a while. It wasn't intentional, not at first. But as the tension in her marriage grew, Sophie found herself confiding in Matt more often, seeking his companionship and validation in the small moments when Lucas wasn't there for her. It was innocent at first, just talking, laughing together, but Sophie couldn't deny the connection that was forming between them. The more she leaned on Matt, the further she felt from Lucas. The distance between her and Lucas seemed to widen each day. And Sophie, though desperate to hold onto the love she once believed was unshakable, couldn't help but wonder if the unraveling had already begun. It was a Saturday evening when everything finally cracked. Sophie had spent the day alone, tidying up the house and trying to distract herself from the growing unease that had settled in her chest. Lucas had gone out with some friends, a rare occurrence, but she hadn't thought much of it at first. They both needed space, sometimes, she reasoned. It wasn't unusual for him to spend time away, especially after the busy weeks they'd both had. But as the hours dragged on, Sophie's unease grew. She texted him once, then again, but there was no response. When he finally walked through the door late that night, Sophie was sitting at the kitchen table, the uneaten dinner still on the stove. The sound of his keys scraping against the counter felt too loud in the silence. "Hey," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Lucas looked at her, his expression immediately guarded. "Sorry I'm late. It was a long night." Sophie watched him closely, noting the way his eyes lingered too long on the floor, the slight tremor in his hands as he set down his jacket. Something was off. Something had changed. "I've been trying to reach you," Sophie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why didn't you respond?" Lucas hesitated. I was busy," he muttered, his gaze darting away from hers. The defensiveness in his tone was subtle, but unmistakable. Sophie's heart tightened. She had heard that tone before, in the past when things had been left unsaid, when truths were pushed away for the sake of comfort. "I thought we were supposed to be spending the evening together," she said softly, her voice now trembling with a mix of hurt and confusion. "I know, I'm sorry," Lucas replied quickly, though his apology didn't seem to reach his eyes. Sophie searched his face for the warmth she once knew so well, but found only a cold distance instead. It was as if she were looking at a stranger. The silence between them stretched, thick with unspoken words. Sophie's pulse quickened as a thought struck her, an uncomfortable, painful thought that she couldn't ignore any longer. Could there be someone else? The question gnawed at her insides, churning with the fear that had begun to take root weeks ago. Was she losing him to someone else? She stood up, feeling the weight of her question pressing on her chest. "I need to ask you something, Lucas," she said, her voice barely steady. "Is there something you're not telling me?" For a moment, he didn't respond. His jaw clenched, and Sophie could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his body seemed to stiffen. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Instead, he walked past her, his footsteps heavy on the hardwood floor. Sophie watched him go, her heart sinking deeper with every step he took away from her. "I'm sorry," Lucas finally muttered, but the words felt empty. "I didn't mean for it to happen." The confession hung in the air like a dagger. Sophie froze, the room spinning as the implications of his words settled in. She had known, in some part of her, that this moment would come, but hearing it out loud shattered something inside her. "I didn't mean for it to happen," Lucas repeated, though this time, Sophie could no longer hear the sincerity in his voice. And just like that, Sophie's world tilted, her fears realized. Sophie stood in the living room, her body frozen in place, the weight of Lucas's words settling and like an anchor pulling her to the floor. "I didn't mean for it to happen." The words echoed in her mind, but they offered no comfort. She had known something was off, but hearing him admit to it, admitting to betrayal, felt like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just the affair, it was the realization that everything she had built with him, the trust and the love, had been fragile all along. Lucas stood near the doorway, his back turned to her. He didn't know what to say, or perhaps didn't know how to say it. Sophie's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she wished she could disappear, vanish into thin air, and escape the pain. But there was no running from this. She had to confront it, had to face him and the shattered pieces of their marriage. "Who is she?" Sophie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The question had been on the tip of her tongue since the moment she had suspected. Now, the words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and unavoidable. Lucas hesitated, the silence between them stretching too long. Finally he muttered, "Her name's Claire. We work together. It just happened." Sophie's stomach twisted.
Claire.
Sophie had seen her around before. Charming, attractive, always laughing a little too loudly, her eyes always lingering a bit too long on Lucas when they were in the same room. Sophie had never suspected anything, never thought to question the woman who smiled too brightly at her husband. But now it all made sense, in a way that made Sophie sick to her core. You didn't even think to tell me?" Sophie asked, her voice cracking. She took a step back, her hand clutching her chest as if to hold herself together. The pain was raw, but beneath it was a growing anger, a fury that had been simmering since the first hint of distance had crept into their relationship. Lucas turned to face her, his eyes full of regret. "I never wanted to hurt you. I didn't mean for it to go this far," he repeated, as though the words could fix everything, as though they could erase the betrayal. But Sophie wasn't sure anything could. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She loved him, that much was clear, but the trust was gone. Their marriage had been built on it, and without it, there was nothing left but fragments. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Sophie said, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. It wasn't just the affair. It was the silence, the lies, the way he had chosen someone else over her, even for a moment. The hurt felt like a wound that wouldn't heal. Lucas stepped closer, his voice pleading. "Sophie, please.
I'm sorry.
I'll do anything. I want to fix this." But Sophie wasn't sure anymore if it could be fixed. She had always thought that love could overcome anything but trust. Trust was a different kind of strength, one that couldn't be rebuilt overnight. She knew now that it wasn't just about forgiveness. It was about finding herself again, about reclaiming the piece of her heart that Lucas had taken with him. "I need time," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I need to figure out if there's anything left worth saving." As she turned and walked toward the bedroom, leaving Lucas standing in the doorway, Sophie realized something she hadn't understood before. Healing wasn't about making the pieces fit again. Sometimes it was about knowing when to let go. And as she closed the door behind her, the world outside seemed impossibly distant, as if nothing would ever be the same again.